This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you now reside.
My name is Paul Edgar Hebert, and I live in the town of Barnstable.
Where did you live for the majority of your childhood and young adult life?
Fall River, Massachusetts.
What was that like?
Well, I was born in Fall River, and then at age 3 we moved into Somerset, and that's where, from there on, I grew up. Yeah. And Somerset was classified as the bedroom of the city of Fall River, so it was a little more suburban.
How did you end up on Cape Cod?
In 1981, I was looking for a job, and I applied nationally, and I ended up working for the Craigville Conference Center as a food service director. That's how we got here.
What was your family like when you were a child?
A very typical family. We had I have an older sister and an older brother, a younger sister and a younger brother in that order. I was the middle child. An intact family, if you will, a mom and a dad. And both mom and dad worked, and we had a very nice childhood. Well, average American family, if there is such a thing.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
Very good question. My earliest thought was that I was definitely going to some kind of college, but I wasn't sure what. But by the time I graduated, I was very involved in church, Catholic church at the time. And so I went on to seminary. I went to Fairfield University at a House of Studies to be a Glen Mary home missionary, which would be in Appalachia and the South. And so that lasted for 1 year. Decided that wasn't for me, and then I went to my next love, which was food, so I went to become a chef. So I'm a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America, which at the time was in New Haven, Connecticut.
What was your educational experience like?
Well, after graduating from high school, it became kind of a hodgepodge. I went to, again, Fairfield University for 1 year, and then I went to Culinary Institute of America for 2 years. And then the war was in full blaze, and so having a very low draft number, I knew I was on my way to being drafted anyway. And what I'd had was a deferment up to that point, because you usually could have some college education, if not a full degree, before, even if you had a low draft number. So it was pretty much written that I was going to be called in. It was clear I was going to be called in. So my issue back then was much more the idea that free men should not be drafted into the military. So psychologically, I knew that it was not going to work for me, so I enlisted. And because of my background with culinary arts and stuff, I had a lot of options and what to go into. So I knew that I would go into what we call an MOS, a military occupational skills, and that I was able to apply to be a food inspector. So I felt good about that.
What do you think was your happiest memory before the war?
That's a very interesting question. I think just family was kind of my happy spot. Family was very, very important to me, and I also was very active in the church, and that was another strong point in my life.
What was your saddest memory before the war?
I think there was an overall sadness that we still were in a place where we fought one another, we killed one another, and we thought that was solution to problems and to world peace. And so I think that was my big part of sadness was, why can't we get along? Why do we have to kill each other?
What did you think of the war in Vietnam before you got involved?
So the war was really kind of, it was started with President Kennedy getting us involved. So you're looking at the early 60s, then followed closely after that by President Johnson moving that forward. So the war was escalating rapidly. We were committing more and more people. The rationale was, if we send more troops, we can be successful. And the way you give honor to the thousands who had already been lost was to put many more thousands at risk. So the logic that we were following was not clear. So I just wanted to do my part. As anybody else, I wanted to be patriotic. I love my country. I wanted what was right for the country and right for other people. And so I had a lot of mixed feelings about it. I was not involved in the protest marches that were going on. one big difference between what's going on now and what was going on then is there was no draft. And so the draft in Vietnam meant that many more people felt that their loved ones, including themselves, could end up being drafted and going to the war. You have to remember that we weren't that far away from World War II. My dad, all my uncles had served in World War II. So the mentality was, that's what you kind of did. You followed suit. I'd lost an uncle who died in the Normandy invasion. So I think there was a part of yourself that said, well, I have to do the right thing. And so the tradition was set.
And what did your friends and family think about the war?
Friends and family were very supportive of any decision. I mean, I could have made any decision. I could have said I was a conscious objector at that point, and they would have been comfortable with that. I don't know how they would have felt about it if I would have done any other choice than that. Once I decided that I was going in, and it was the way I was going to do it, and that I couldn't tolerate being drafted, they understood my point of view, and so they were very, very supportive of it.
And what did you do during the war?
So I trained at Fort Dix, and then after that went to Chicago for intensive training to become a food inspector in the military. So I was a specialist. I was not what you call a rank. I wasn't a sergeant or didn't grow in that. I was a specialty kind of guy. So then I was stationed in Washington, D.C. at Walter Reed Army Hospital in the commissary. There's an extensive Army base there. And so, of course, I would see the results of Vietnam. Some of the men that I was serving with came to Walter Reed. The first one that I witnessed, he came hobbling along and didn't have his foot anymore. And then I got very involved with the chaplain's office there, unofficially, not from the military, but just because I was at that post. So I used to go and read letters to the guys who had come back. Some of them were blind and or injured, and so I would read the letters from their families to them and spend some time with them. So I witnessed firsthand what was coming back from Vietnam. And of course our medical abilities was growing rapidly, so whereas in many previous wars men died, the numbers of casualties we were finding were going up, as opposed to in the percentages of people who were dying. So because our ability to save more lives, we extended the lives, but the injuries were more and more serious, so we had a lot of seriously life injuries for the rest of one's life.
Why did you enlist?
Well, again, because I couldn't tolerate the concept in a free country of being drafted. And we didn't have in the country, and I think we should have. We don't have it today. I mean, we do have the Peace Corps, but if everybody had to do 1 or 2 years of service in the country, that would be a great thing. But service could be helping in your state. It could be helping with the hungry, the poor, teaching, whatever it is that you do some kind of service. So, but going into the service drafted, I couldn't psychologically deal with that. So I enlisted rather than to be drafted. I don't know if that's answering your question correctly, but
It's good. What were your first thoughts when you found out that you had a low draft number?
That didn't upset me. It's my number, and that's the way it is, and I didn't give that much thought.
Describe a typical day in basic training.
Survival. There was never enough food. I mean, they fed us, but I was always hungry. I was always tired, and always aching, and so all you dreamt about was, can I get some extra sleep? You didn't want to get in any kind of trouble. I went in October, so I was there in basic training November and December. So back then you didn't do any, we call it bivouacking, and we call it camping. So because upper respiratory infection was always a big problem at basic training in that season, we didn't do any of that stuff. But outside of that, it was, you did your marching, and then you did all of the skills that you had to have. There was always the physical component, the ability to do the calisthenics and, strength, but then there was training, hand-to-hand combat, and rifle weaponry, and that type of thing. I ended up an expert in M16, and expert in the grenade, just kind of a little on the funny side. If I threw the grenade and didn't go very far, and so the tower yelled, short, short, and the sergeant that was training me threw himself over me, and shot stones and stuff fell all over us. So because I was almost suicidal, I got an expert in grenade also.
And also, could you specify what is an M16?
M16, at the time, I think they most probably have another weapon, but that was the standard military issue as opposed to an M14 rifle. The M16 had a cartridge of 20 rounds, and it could be semi-automatic, one shot, so that was the weapon that we were trained on.
What comes to mind when you hear the word Vietnam?
That would be a tremendous sadness, and more like a hole in my soul of a period of time where we lived in chaos, a lot of confusion. So that was that. I think that's the best way. It's like a hole when you mention Vietnam to me.
What was your happiest or proudest memory during the war?
That's a tough question. I also, besides, I was very active when I was in Washington, D.C., and I was very much still attached to civilian life. So I met people that used to come to the chapel when we had church every Sunday. And so I got friends with families in the area. So I used to spend time with some of the young people and help teach religious ed classes at the local parish. So I think that was my happiest time.
What was your saddest or angriest memory during the war?
That I'm very, very clear of. When I was stationed in Chicago, that was the time of Kent State. I don't know if you're familiar with Kent State, but what happened there is there was a lot of protests going on in the country. And Kent State in Ohio, there was a big demonstration on the college campus, university, and the troops, National Guard, were called out, and in the ensuing confusion, somebody started shooting, and students were killed, and students were injured. And to that point, I was totally focused on being of service and protecting people as a food inspector. Again, I was still in training for that, but very dedicated to following procedures and being proud that I was doing my share, helping, I thought. And when Kent State happened, it completely turned me into somebody different. And so when we were asked, what would we have done if we were issued and asked to go down to Chicago to help contain some of the rioting and some of the protesting that was going on, myself, as well as others, said we would not put ever put bullets in our guns. We wouldn't carry any bullets. We would never shoot at civilians. We would not charge anybody. We would not push anybody. We were Americans, and we were not going to hurt other Americans. So that was bad.
What relationships did you form while you were serving?
You don't tend to make a whole lot. When you're in combat, that's a different story, because you're only as safe as the buddy who's with you in the foxhole or in the trucks. So relationships, there wasn't too much. When you were basic training, you knew that you were all scattering after basic training to everywhere, and to advanced training and different training. And then when you were at specific training, again, you knew you weren't going to last long together. So the months that I spent in Chicago training, we all knew that we're going all over the country after that. We were kind of a small elite group anyway. So I ended up in Chicago, and then again in Chicago I spent most of my time with civilians when I could. So I didn't form a whole lot of relationships, no alumni.
What was your experience as a food inspector like?
That was great. I was stationed at a commissary I loved what I was doing. I was very, very focused, considerate, very, very important. I almost wrote a novel on the whole idea of it, because your troops are only as good as the food that you're giving them. So if they got sick, I was very proud of keeping people healthy through good food. So obviously, if you had an outbreak of food poisoning, you could have 500-600 troops that needing other people to take care of them. So that would be a disaster. So I walked with great pride in the work that I was doing. But I almost, like I say, wrote a novel about the importance and a whole story about food inspection.
If you had to choose one word to describe your military career, what would it be and why?
I'm just going to put in the classification of experience. It was a very awesome experience, and looking back, it helped make who I am today. The importance of the logistics of moving lots of people and working hard together and to focus on one particular task helped shape me looking at management and how you solve problems and be a problem solver. So I think I took that from that military experience.
Were there any other noteworthy events during your military career that you'd like to mention?
Only when I finally declared myself as a conscientious objector. What was going on while I was there was Vatican II had just taken place. So again, I was still very...
What was Vatican II?
Vatican II was when the Catholic Church had a big meeting of all the cardinals and the leadership of the Catholic Church. And under Pope John the 23rd, what they did is they said, what are all our stances and our positions and what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And so in that, they talked about being a conscientious objector who said that, we were against war and we were against killing and taking of life. And so I studied it, I read it, and it was ultimately a few young people like yourself who actually said to me, Paul, you're a contradiction, because we see you as really somebody who walks the talk of being a Christian and loving people, and yet you wear the uniform of the United States. So what's that all about? So I think that they really shook me to my core, and I started to study more and to understand who I was. And finally, I declared myself a conscientious objector, which I believed I was just going to go to jail. I thought that I would go to jail. But I worked with a lieutenant colonel who was right in the Pentagon. I used to go to the Pentagon and report to him occasionally. And I worked with officers who liked what I did and said how sincere I was. So ultimately, when I declared myself a conscientious objector, they said there is a policy, there is a procedure for you to be discharged as a conscientious objector. So I went through all that, reviews, letters, documentation, and ultimately the head of my division, I said I'm going to have to take the uniform off because the process was taking a long time, but ultimately they said that they wouldn't let me go until I got an honorable discharge, which I did.
What was going through your head when you got the honorable discharge?
Excellent questions. It was not a celebration because there was a part of me who felt in some ways that I was deserting, my fellow soldiers, if you will. It's as non-combative as my position was. I was there to support. I saw them as my brothers in the military. So there was a part of me that said, you're deserting them, you're leaving them. And so, you're trained to care for one another, take care of each other. So that was kind of difficult in its own sense. The other one was, what am I being called to? So when you close one door in your life, you have to, I think if you're a thinking person, you say, where am I being called to? So I knew from that day on I had to work for greater peace in the world.
What would you consider to be your greatest achievement after the military?
Right now, having gotten married and having 3 beautiful children and 4 grandchildren is certainly awesome. I went on and finally got my bachelor's degree, and since then I've been a community man. That's my big goal, is to build community and work for community. So I did start a nonprofit that housed people at risk of homelessness, and so I was able to work with that population. So we started Champ Homes on Cape Cod, and my wife and I together co-founded that, and we've cared for over 2,500 people. And so I've certainly been proud of that, but that's not the end of my story, and I'm still moving forward.
What do you think was the inspiration for Champ Homes?
Oh, the basic, again, the human suffering. We started it in 1990 was really the beginning of it, and we were looking at, what are the needs in our community, but there were people already in Cape Cod who were sleeping outside. People were hungry. The numbers were growing. What had happened throughout the country, but specifically in Massachusetts, we had closed a lot of the mental health facilities, and with the promise that there would be more help within the local communities, that really didn't get to the point that it needed to be. So more and more people started finding themselves homeless. Also, the economy would have trouble, so young people often lost hope, and so they would find themselves in the street. Vietnam veterans as a whole, many came back, were not respected, were not appreciated, and were given a very difficult time, little support. Very interesting that 2/3 of all Vietnam veterans have already died, many through suicide. We lose almost every hour, every day, a military person commits suicide.
How do you think your military experience has affected some of your achievements, such as serving on the Barnstable Town Council, co-founding Champ Homes, and the book that you wrote?
Again, I think it's reaching out to the community, and so I think that when you feel like you are close to the violence and close to the hate in the world, then I think you strive more to bring respect and caring for one another, love for each other. So I think that's what's driven me since, to be a community person and make a difference in people's lives. That's been my biggest motivation.
And what was your response to the amnesty to the draft dodgers?
Again, the turmoil that we were living with at the time was horrendous. So I had no problem with amnesty for anybody who wanted to come back. A great idea.
What, if anything, would you change about your military career?
Again, you have wonderful questions. I don't think it would have changed a thing. I think that a lot was accomplished. If I had not gone in, I wouldn't be able to understand as much the suffering of our veterans today. I think it increased my sensitivity to the veterans. So I don't think I'd want to change any of it. If I could go back and change Kent State, I would.
How often does your military experience come up in your day-to-day life?
It's surprisingly how often it comes up, because when you're talking to, especially when I'm talking to guys my own age who were in the military, that's an opportunity to share those experiences. It's very interesting that basic training, which is really based 8 weeks, the impact that has on your life. There's not a veteran that can't look back and talk about their basic training or their experience. So we're veterans for the rest of our lives, but you usually serve 2 to 4 years. Draft was 2 years. When you enlist, it was I think it was 3 years or 4 years, I forget. But it's a big difference. But it's a small piece of your life, but it affects the whole of your life.
What is one instance in which your military experience has either helped or hurt you?
As interesting as conscious objector, you do feel you have a greater sense of confidence. So I've taken some chances that most people wouldn't take. You feel a little bit more invincible. So a good example was, while I was still in Chicago, a young man was running down the street with this other man screaming. It happened to be a young man of color, and this security guy was chasing him down the road. Now, if it wasn't for my military background and feeling that I could take care of myself, I chased and helped catch the young man, and the security guard was going to throw handcuffs on him. This is in Chicago, in the late '60s. A white guy was going to put cuffs on a man of color, and I stood my ground. By this time, there was hundreds of people around us, and I said to the man, I held the young man, and I said, "You're not touching this young man until the police come here." So I may have prevented a riot, which I don't think I would have done if I didn't have the training that I'd had. So there was a benefit there.
How do you think your military experience affects some of the issues going on today, or your view on some of the issues going on today?
Well, it has everything to do with our defense. The biggest part of our budget here in the United States is still our military, and it's going up all the time, and we're still. So my basic definition of foreign policy, let's just take Israel and Palestine. My attitude is it's much better to send big bread trucks across the border, or trucks with food, medicine, books, education, and care for people than it is to send a single tank over, which just aggravates the situation. So I wish that we were spending a quarter of what we're spending on the military on housing for people and education and health care and taking care of each other. That would be much more positive. So while we need a military, we're really kind of off balance.
Are there any other notable instances in which your military experience has affected your life?
Well, I think it's the constant reminder to work harder for peace. President Kennedy said that the conscientious objector, until there won't be any peace until the conscientious objector is as honored as the warrior. So until we change our attitude and we change in how we look at our perceptions, we're never going to really experience the peace that the world desperately needs right now.
Who, if anyone, that you met in the military did you stay in contact with?
Really, nobody. No, we separated, which I don't think is unusual. If you weren't, especially if you weren't in a combat unit, I think that you just disperse back into your communities.
Have you returned to Fort Dix or Chicago or D.C.?
No. You mean like an alumni going back to the campus? No.
If a young person, such as one of your grandchildren, came up to you and asked for advice about joining the military, what would you say to them?
I would discourage it. I would encourage community involvement. And community commitment. But I would discourage it. On the other hand, if that's what they feel is their calling, we need good people in the military. So I have a nephew who's serving in the Air Force, and he's a great young man, and so I totally support him in his decision to be there.
Do you have any other advice, not regarding the military, that you would like to give to any young people?
I think that we need to increase our hopefulness, and so what I see when I look at the poverty, when I see people without work, people who need housing, is to not give up, that we can make a difference. I think the biggest thing is for all of us to make an impact in our community and make a difference. So if we want to talk about what it means to be a loyal citizen, I think that you have to look at what is the justice for all peoples, and a defender of democracy for all people. So my advice is keep on trucking.
And are there any closing statements that you would like to make?
I really appreciate what you're doing and what your class is doing, what your school is doing, and it's so clear to me that our future rests in folks like yourself, all right, who are taking on a project like this. There are a lot of other projects that people might find much more interesting, but to give a voice to the war, I cannot thank you enough and compliment you for your efforts in doing that and your whole class. And again, I see you all as the future of our country, and I applaud you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.